Some people aren't sure if they like it. I told Marianne, this book, when I read it, I thought it was like, it was of the quality of John Howard Yoder's Politics of Jesus. In the sense that there is that generation of reflection on Anabaptist vision and discipleship, the work that whole generation had done came together so well in this book, at least for me. And so it's a book that I've gone back to many times, and some of you don't know it. So I'd like to pull out a few things from this book, because I do think at least the framework of it is very helpful. Some of it I've already mentioned. He's looking at all the literature out there on spirituality, and there is so much, both Christian and non-Christian. But even the Christian literature on spirituality is limited, and in the sense that he sees it's either related to this kind of self-actualization that we spoke of, discovering your inner true self, and maybe, if you're lucky, uncovering the divine in the process. And so that the better Christian literature talks about the kind of spirituality, spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices that will that have the goal of this of a personal relationship with God. That's good. He's not criticizing it, but it's primarily a spirituality of individual discipline and discovery. Community is not needed. Community is not part of that understanding of spirituality, nor is the kind of engagement of our culture, the missional stuff that we've been talking about, or ethics. It's not part of that package. And so the unique contribution of this book, he's teaching also at a very, very large American evangelical seminary, but he's there as a Mennonite. And so this is a wonderful contribution to saying, there are other streams of Christian spirituality that the larger ecumenical church can learn from. And Anabaptists have nurtured this stream that includes a third dimension, where spirituality, where there's love of God, love of self, and inherently also love of the neighbor, love of the enemy, love of the other, as part of that larger vision and goal of spiritual formation. So he sees this as a third alternative, and it's really an alternative to a spirituality that focuses only on the conversion experience or the pietistic experience, and he argues it has a longer Christian tradition. It's not just the Anabaptists or Mennonites that have discovered this, but there's a longer, more ancient tradition. So the goal then is to come to know Christ through participation in the practices of discipleship, which express love to others and results in practices of inner depth. It's a long sentence, but it expresses basically what we've been saying this morning, and it connects this to some sayings, in particular by Hans Denk, that we've frequently repeat in our Mennonite literature about not being able to come to Christ without the other, without the neighbor. And so that relationship, the communal part is essential to this spirituality. So I want to unpack that. And let's see. Okay, so these are Augsburger's words or terms, but they're not new again. They're not new for any of us. Radical attachment to Jesus That's his translation of, for those of you who may have some German in your soul, Nachfolge Christi, or Jüngerschaft, right? Early Anabaptists talked a lot about Nachfolge, discipleship. And at its core is, or he translates it as a radical attachment, which he specifies as, it's not just believing in Jesus. It's not just believing in Jesus, but it's believing what Jesus believed. And that's different. You can believe in Jesus, and that's a cognitive thing. But believing in Jesus to the extent that you believe in what he believes, that's a lifelong journey. And becoming, that connects with our earlier passages from Paul, growing in Christ, becoming Christ-like, becoming transformed in the image of Christ. It's about imitation. So imitating Christ, being so radically attached that one follows after him in life. And in this way, we go about forming our identity, a Christ-like identity. And we know we do that all the time. We have our images or our idols. We see it especially in children. They're very quick to identify who they have respect for or who they look up to. And then it's natural that you begin to try and pattern your life in that regard. Waldemar Jansen's ethics book does a very fine job of working with this idea of imitation and of identifying with characters in his work on prophet, priest, and king in the Old Testament. So, radical attachment to Jesus asks, what would Jesus do? It also asks, what did Jesus do? And it's more than just simply imitating Jesus, but also asking the question, what would Jesus want me to do in this situation? It might require something different. But in any case, it connects with Paul's a request that we be imitators of him just as he is of Christ, until Christ is formed in our lives. So, that's Augsburger's first practice. He says these aren't disciplines. That other way of talking about spiritual formation talks a lot about spiritual disciplines, praying, fasting, etc., all important. But critical are practices that shape our desires, that shape our passions, make us into lovers of the kingdom. So, the new church plant in Ottawa, if you've ever gone on their website, their motto is passion for love of Jesus and passion for justice. Is that right? Yes, passion for Jesus and lovers of justice, something like that. And so I think they get this piece right. The second practice is stubborn loyalty. Or another translation would be solidarity in community. And the phrase that he picks up on from early Anabaptist texts is, or the word is Gemeinschaft, or community. And certainly a term that is very familiar to all Mennonite groups, I think. That the deep significance of the fact that we are co-travelers with each other and that somehow we're in solidarity. Sometimes that hasn't always felt very comfortable, and some of those stories came out. But there's a sense that when we believe in Jesus, we join a group of people who gathers around Jesus, and that is somehow our primary social location that identifies us. We are part of this group that gathers around Jesus. And it's this group that experiments with virtues that try and capture who Jesus is and what Jesus' message is. And this church works hard to embody beliefs in their own communal life, and as they try and practice the imitation of Christ. So stubborn loyalty, and I think we know something about that. Stubborn loyalty to those with whom we are traveling together. The Baptists have a very nice word for this. They call it watch care. Some of you maybe have read McClendon's Ethics in your seminary studies, and he talks about watch care, that when we become believers, God places us on a path, it's on a journey, and always puts us together with others. And one of our essential to that is watching and caring for each other, so that when we stumble, there's someone to pick us up. When we are in danger by what we're danger caused from externally or in our own thinking and doing, we have what we used to call church discipline, or we have people who watch and care for us, who are on the journey together with us. The next set of practices he calls tenacious serenity or willing obedience. The German word would be, you wouldn't find it in Gelassenheit. That's a terrible word to try and translate. And so there are many different options. Some of you might be close to Amish or Old Order background, and maybe that word is more familiar. But Gelassenheit, really, there's a sense of yieldedness, of submission of your will, although it's not simply resignation and willing nothing. But it's a term that I think really has shaped many of our congregations. This idea that we can relinquish, for example, our own rights because of the brother or sister in need, or their own sense of what they need. It goes together with and shapes patience in us and in congregations that emphasize Gelassenheit. Patience that it's not up to us to make the world turn out all right. It's in God's hands. God is the one who is reconciling, redeeming, and but because we can yield and be serene with what has happened, we can also then feel free to witness to our hope. So a relinquishment of the self to what is truly good. Okay, so another term, habitual humility or unpretentious personhood. And of course, that has a long history in Christian spirituality. The German word, by the way, if you're still interested in that, Demut, humility. And that goes all the way back to, I'm thinking of Benedict, so that's pretty early, but even earlier than that. If you ever have the chance to pick up Benedict's rules, which shaped the Benedictine monastic movement and shaped very much some of the early Anabaptist thinking. Michael Sattler was a Benedictine monk. Very fascinating emphasis there in Benedict's rules on humility. And for Augsburger, this is the undeniable sign of Christian discipleship, because it's a sincere concern for the good of others, balanced with a gratitude that one's own life too is a gift. So it's humility that is behind any Mennonite value of simplicity, or living a simple life. It's not about living simply, some might argue, is about perfectionism, right? You've probably heard that argument. But he's saying that's not how Anabaptists have understood it. It's connected with humility. It's connected with a deep humility, a deep sense that we're not perfect. And that's why this kind of lifestyle. Not striving for divinity. We're not trying to be like God, but we're actually humble because we're recognizing our full humanity. And for those of you who know a little bit of Latin, humility is connected with the word for earth or dirt or dust, humus, right? And so Adam, same Hebrew word, right? We're of dust, and that's important to think about in the spiritual life occasionally. The fifth practice, resolute nonviolence, or the way of the cross. Again, it has something to do with this Gelassenheit, or tenacious serenity. Because my life is in God's hands, I will never take the life of my enemy. That's a John Howard Yoder quote. Resolute nonviolence is the true evidence of love for the neighbor, of the enemy, or the persecutor. And the sixth one, concrete service. This is the practice of serving Christ by serving the neighbor. It's not about me, but about the one being served. And then the seventh one, authentic witness. So, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. You've heard that quote, right? This kind of genuine presence, sharing with others, sharing one's deepest beliefs, values, and hopes. So these are a cluster of practices which Augsburger says we know, we've cherished, we've kept alive. Practices, he says, which the mainline churches have had in the 16th century or whenever, sort of offloaded as unnecessary for being and doing church. These are ones that Anabaptists have, however, treasured. And the tone of this is not to blow our horn, but rather to offer it as an ecumenical gift in these dangerous times where we're all on the margins. And that these are practices that shape and form desires such that we become lovers of a certain kind of vision. And so getting back to our table discussions, these kinds of practices, when we involve ourselves in doing some of these things in our children, the theory, the assumption is that it's in the practices that habits will be formed, and habits form then identity. And he calls this kind of spirituality dissident and subversive. And that's it's connected a little bit with that Hauerwas quote, right, of corrupting our youth. And a spirituality, I think we can understand that if we have been talking about church as an alternative community, that church and the political community are not one and the same, but that the church is something other. The church is pointing to another kingdom. Well, then it indeed follows that in some ways we are dissidents. In some ways we are, by what we're saying and what we're inviting people to participate in, that it's subversive. It's subversive of another story, of other values, of other commitments and loyalties. And that's not going to happen with information. That happens through formation and inviting people to be part of a community that practices certain kinds of values that shape certain kinds of people. And as I mentioned, that's not new. I mean, all of us know, all those pieces are somehow familiar. It's packaged together very nicely. And but it's a reminder, just like in our discussions here too, a reminder of the kind of spirituality that we indeed have witnessed and lived in our churches, and that we need to probably, in many respects, redesign for our present context, which is unique and different. Augsburger says much of this too is found in the work that appeared some 25 years earlier, Don Crable's Upside Down Kingdom. I think many of you have that book probably on your bookshelf, and it's virtually the same thesis, and many of the examples are the same as well. So, excuse me. That might be fine and good, but we're dealing with some problems. Getting back to the Rockway discussion, why has it become difficult? And one of the points we said was our context has changed. The other question was, has our theology changed? Is that part of the difficulty here? And I just want to say a few things in that regard, and think about the theology that we've been taught, if for those of us who have been to Bible college or seminary in the last 30 years or so. We're largely familiar with the name Harold Bender, the recovery of the Anabaptist vision. That was a piece that came out 1944. It's a long time ago. And it had a huge impact on the identity of North American Mennonites. And you might recall he defines the essence of Christianity as discipleship, which is our theme here today. Discipleship to Jesus Christ. And he conceives of church differently too. Church as participation in a voluntary faith community. And he adds to that a third dimension. The Anabaptist vision had a commitment to nonviolent love. This had a large impact in the 50s, and the younger students studying with him. And the most important name there is John Howard Yoder. Many of you are familiar with his work, The Politics of Jesus. And in many ways, Yoder continues that tradition, beginning with Bender, with this vision of Anabaptism that hinges not so much on doctrinal belief or subjective experience. Right? You can have a theology that emphasizes a certain theological idea, or you can have a theology too that begins with or is rooted in a certain kind of or a certain type of experience. This was something different. It emphasizes the communal, political, and ethical dimensions of the gospel. And I think this is something that many of us fell in love with in the 70s and the 80s. And it fueled our passions and our vision for the kingdom. He uncovered an economic and political application of the gospel that resonated very well in that era, especially in the United States, where this had a strong anti-war aspect. And it was a bestseller, and still is, not just amongst Mennonites. And so North American Mennonites in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s came to identify themselves as a Christian tradition that's probably more devoted to right praxis or orthopraxis than right doctrine. Now, it's a little bit black and white, but yeah, it's right practice matters. And together with that, there was this model, a communal model of discipleship. And that was something, an alternative to Christianity in North America, defined primarily in individualistic terms. A Christianity that really emphasized the inner spiritual experience. So that too is one piece of the puzzle when we ask, where have we been? It's a very important piece. And even if those names are foreign to you, they're not to the leadership that has shaped our churches. But what happened as a result of this is also interesting. And you might be more familiar with this, what you might call a bifurcation. There was, on the one hand, many Mennonites who were passionate about peace and justice, passionate about being active Christians, being activists. And Yoder and Bender were, in a sense, the heroes of that vision, or the fathers of that vision. A vision that accented political, the politics of Jesus as part of the mission. And so out of that came new disciplines that we became passionate about. Conflict, first it was conflict resolution, and now it's conflict transformation. And I think there was an earlier mediation. And yeah, so in other words, from our work in Anabaptist peace studies, we've made quite a significant impact with other types of peace studies. Now, there was a danger to this as well. It was very easy for that whole vision to be abstracted from the cross and the resurrection of Christ, and that all of this peace stuff becomes another human possibility, another social program. I don't think that was the case with John Howard Yoder or with Harold Bender, but certainly in some parts of the Mennonite church that was the case. And there was a certain kind of burnout that was experienced by some of our peace activists. So that's the one side. And the other side, those Mennonites who emphasized a conversionist model of evangelism, where they tended to identify with the political right, more or less. They downplayed more or less how the gospel addresses the evils of war, poverty, and racism. And there were but they emphasized this relationship with Jesus. They emphasized a certain kind of spirituality, which was sometimes seen as missing in what they saw in the Mennonite press. Now, we could talk about what is the cause of this. What was the cause of this bifurcation? And I've got some ideas about that. But I was impressed recently by an article I saw by Nelson Craybill, the former AMBS president, who argued that it's precisely these two poles that absolutely need to be brought back together. Quote, "Our future as a church and the long-term viability of our witness in the world will depend upon a reuniting of the evangelical and the activist impulses that have divided us in the past century." Again, it sounds kind of like John Taves. Our church is not going to survive unless... But there's some truth here. And the good thing is, the more we invest ourselves in thinking about a missional spirituality, I think the more evident it becomes that these two poles actually can be brought back together. And I'd like to suggest a few things in this regard.